get started. My name is Chris Kohlberg. I'm a supervisory staff accountant with the Northern Region Accounting Branch. And welcome to the USDA ReConnect Virtual Post-Award Workshop. Today, I'm going to be delivering the management analysis profiles. And I'm going to start with the slides and then transition to 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A at the end. Today, this is a basic idea of what we're going to go through on our agenda: the definition and purpose of a management analysis profile, roles and responsibility, map activities, desktop review, on-site visit, and map report. So basically, what is a map? A management analysis profile or map process is basically a snapshot in time where we've, through the process of the award or analysis of financial statements or other items, that we need to identify something that specifically we need to look at to provide further information and make sure the awardee is successful. So some of those are just a general assessment of strengths and weaknesses, a review of your operations, review of technical ability, review of management capability, and overall discussion of with management related to anything from forecasting to construction procedures to internal controls over accounting, any of those items. So basically what happens is it's a snapshot in time, and we're trying to go through and identify information to make this awardee successful. The essential purpose of this is to ensure that the borrower can meet our debt service requirements as they are outlined in the application requirements. We're setting up the awardees for success, or we're making sure the systems are in place for adequate management and reporting on the broadband project. And as I mentioned before, ultimately what we're trying to do there is identify a specific purpose when we made the map. And we have scheduled the map with you to discuss those specific items. Basically, we have multiple team members that would be involved in a map. The map team leader, the map team specialist that working on finance, marketing, and business operations. We'd also have a map specialist that will be specializing in the engineering construction side. A map specialist who would be involved with the accounting and internal control oversight, and just a general map specialist who has some insights into the actual awardee itself. So there's two types of really a map that we would perform. One would be a desktop review. We've identified that we do not need to go out on site, but we can obtain some of the more information and have some discussions with you via conference calls to identify those specific items that we would look at, and we would do it just as a desktop review. The other type would be a full site visit. In what we would do there is you'd have several steps. First, we'd have an entrance conference just to kind of go over the scope of what we're specifically looking at. Each specialist would have individual staff meetings, and then we would do a review of files and records, and at the end of it, have an exit conference. Or in some cases, we would have the exit conference after we've got the map report completed. Just so you know, from our perspective, when we do these site visits, what we're allocating for is about 3 business days on site, 1 day of travel on either end. So we would be a Monday through Friday. Hopefully it would be a little bit shorter than that, but those are basically what we would look at. And the other item would be that we would try to obtain information even on a site visit up front. Hold on one second, I've just got to move some stuff down here. So desktop review. So topics for review, and again, this is also some information that we would probably obtain through the prior to the on-site visit, and those are operations compared to description in the application. So there may be some concerns that what was described in the application is insufficient, or possibly that we need to get some clarification on how your operations do occur. Organizational structure and governance. affiliate agreements, and that's an important item there is to keep in mind is that if there's disclosure of significant affiliated transactions, we need to make sure that those affiliated transactions are being accounted for properly and that the taxpayer dollars are being protected. In your actual design, there may be some questions related to the broadband network and system, the marketing plan and subscriber forecasts. Those, especially from the standpoint of if your forecast is very tight, we need to know that your marketing plan is strong enough to make sure that you get through those early years so that you can do repayment. Capital financing, as I mentioned just in the last sentence, financial forecasts, financial information and records, and that's just in general. There may be some concern that your internal controls and documentation and systems have not been adequately set up yet. And so we just want to make sure that they are, so that as you move forward, you can be successful. Basically, when we look at the desktop review, this will inform us for the actual site visit questions and observations, or as I mentioned, if we actually decide that we can finish it from a desktop standpoint, we would go from there. But that would basically make the determination here of whether we branch off to just finalize a desktop review or if we're going to move forward with an actual site visit. Just in general, when we get on site, we provide an entrance conference. We introduce the team, go through who they are. You would also introduce yourselves as to who the important people are that we'll need to meet with. And we'll go over the purpose of the visit, the items that we're specifically hoping to accomplish while we're out on site. Then we will do the meetings with individual awardee personnel. Each specialist will split up into their respective areas and go look at operations, look at accounting, look at marketing, look at finance, talk to the general manager, talk to the construction manager, and get some additional information. The other thing we'll do is kind of make sure we're aligned with our scope, which our scope is the purpose of our visit and the objective we're hoping to achieve. And then we'll also look at things like review of board minutes, files, and other operational documents, just to look at the source documentation and how it exists. And as I said before, at the end of this, we would do an exit conference. And that exit conference would basically go over some of the items that we found, some of the issues that we addressed, and then the expectation of what will come next, which is the map report. The map report basically goes over several items, but it goes over a summary of the actual items that we did by area, by function. So there'll be an area on marketing, on accounting, on operations, just a general overview. And then they'll go into the site visit details, the procedures we actually performed, the information we actually looked at, and what our findings or what our actual analysis came up with. At the end of it, we'll come up with either a summary of recommendations, and those are items that we provide to internally to upper level management so that they can make recommendations to you to improve your system and ensure that you are actually going to be successful in your project. One of the things I would go over just real quick before we transition into that, since I have some additional time, is that we do have some items that may cause some confusion, and so I just want to do some clarification. One of the items that we will do is the GFR will probably go out and do an initial visit with you prior to the advances of awards, maybe even prior to the execution of the actual loan grant agreement. The one item that we also will do is an initial visit by the field accountants. These differ from a management analysis profile in that everyone will actually have an initial visit both by the GFR and by the field accountant. But in general, what will happen is a map will only be done in certain circumstances. And so let me go over a few of those circumstances that we may have. Originally, we thought the organization had set the goal of trying to do a map on all borrowers or all awardees. However, due to time constraints, fiscal constraints, and now circumstances revolving health issues, that will not probably transpire. So we're trying to do a kind of a risk assessment on organizations, financial health, things of that nature, to make a determination of who would actually require a map. If you're a long-term borrower from RUS and you have a strong financial standpoint, you may not have a map done. However, keep in mind, if there's something that concerns us about either your knowledge of the system design or your overall financial forecast or your marketing plan, even a strong organization may require a map. And it may, as I mentioned, it may not be a full-blown map. It may just be a detailed introductory desktop review map, although it could also end up being a site visit. The thing that we are looking at the most is that we want to make sure that each awardee is successful. So during the process of the award and throughout the process of going through and executing the notes and getting to the first advance, we want to identify those areas where each awardee might need some additional help or additional recommendations or additional analysis. So we're keeping it open to doing a map on every individual. However, as I said, more than likely, if you're a strong RUS long-term borrower and you have knowledge, skills, and abilities in this area, along with strong financial forecasts and financial assets, you probably would not have a map. So that being said, I know I went through that a little bit fast. Let me just go over a couple of items that I might have skimmed over. On our scope alignment, at the end of each day for the site visit, we're going to basically, the team actually gets together and reviews their activities as a team. And so we go through and share our points of interest and our findings as we go along so that we can then target each day and be more effective. So, on a case-by-case basis, we would identify some additional risks out there. We might even expand our scope, but we would notify you of that at the end of each day or the beginning of each day when we started our new work. So that being said, I'm going to turn it over now. Keep in mind at 2 p.m. Eastern, the reporting requirements is the next virtual workshop. So I'm going to now open it up for questions and answers. And let me just get started here, and I will look at these answers. Okay, so number one, the first question I have as I read them, Chris, if you're a long-term RUS loan program company, would you probably be a good candidate for a map desktop review? So as I mentioned before, if you're a long-term RUS loan program borrower, more than likely you may not even have a map. It would be totally dependent on information that's disclosed either in your financial statements and or in your application that would maybe determine that an additional map is needed. And keep in mind, that may also be a situation where if you're an electric program borrower, you may have to have a map just because you're now switching programs, and the way the telecommunications program operates is a little different than the way the electric program operates. And so there may be some questions there as to organizational structure and things of that nature. And yes, you would probably be available for a desktop review. However, depending on the circumstances of every awardee, a site visit could also be mandated. The second question I have is, do you have an example of a map for awardees to better understand what that looks like? And so there is a map guide for all internal people, but I'm not sure if the telecom program would be providing that. But essentially, what a map would look like is the 5 areas that I discussed before. we're going to look at just general overview of the company, and then we are specifically going to look at marketing, operations, construction, the overall finance, and then accounting from an internal controls perspective. And realistically, most of that will be targeted towards a single purpose or a single item that we have come across, or a set of items that we feel need to be improved. But the one thing to keep in mind is that I think they can provide you with a little bit more of a outline of what it would go through, but essentially it would be those 5 areas I said: general, construction, finance, accounting, and marketing. No, on question number 3, will 100% of the applicants have a map review? No. As I mentioned at the beginning of my broadcast, our organization originally thought that they might do that. Now we are at the point where we're going to do a risk assessment, and only those borrowers that meet the criteria of any risk assessment or any items that have been brought to light during the application review and award, or during the execution of the note agreements, they would then have be targeted for an actual map, and then we would initiate that conversation with you at a later date. The question I have next is, as an awardee, let me just real quickly, as an awardee, we're a small municipality, not a big ILEC. We don't have a big accounting or engineering resources in-house. It sounds like we will need to hire consultants to do RUS required accounting, communications, etc. I don't believe that that is necessarily the case. What we would identify as you're a small municipality. If your organizational structure is such that you have at least the core competencies to do the job, then you would not necessarily have to hire consultants. But that's actually the point of a map, is that if we identify early on that you have some either perceived deficiencies or actual deficiencies in your accounting or construction or financing or marketing knowledge, we would actually sit down with you and go through this process. And the process is really to help you identify what the recommendations, what improvements you can make so that you can be successful throughout the life of the project. And so in some cases, it may be that you would need additional knowledge, skills, and abilities that you would have to find from an outside third party. But for the most part, we are not, at this point in time, if we make an award, we would not be saying, oh, you have to hire consultants to do RUS required accounting, communications, etc. But keep in mind, that's the whole purpose of a map, and the map is designed to help us identify those needs and those skills that are lacking in any particular organization so that we can make those recommendations and move forward. I think I probably have some more. Okay. Question number 5. If federal grant audits are done by a state auditor's office, would we still need a map? This is a pretty good question. Basically, this has nothing to do with your financial statement audits. What it has to do is with your application or our review of your financial statements, and or any other things that might have come to light during some point in time with our interactions with your organization, and we've determined that there may be a perceived deficiency or there's a risk there that we need to ensure has been addressed as we move forward. So if we identify that you are an entity that would require a map, we would basically be in contact with you. But again, the state auditor's office is a good organization for which the opinion we can rely on, but it isn't something that we would just decide that we are not going to do a map. The map is actually based on what your organization strengths and weaknesses are, and especially if there's some weaknesses that we feel that we can help you improve by doing some upfront visit, that's why we would perform a map. Once the legal documents are executed, will we be notified if a map is required, desktop or full review, or when that may occur? So I would say this. You will be notified as soon as a map has been identified as being necessary. But keep in mind, we actually have performed maps throughout project history, even after the project has gotten off the ground. So as we incur, for example, if you're not meeting your forecast as you move forward, we would actually possibly identify that as a risk and need to look at your marketing plan. So our goal is to give you guys a heads up as soon as we know our risk assessment is done, and I don't know how soon that will be, but I know that it'll be very shortly after or around the time the loan documents are executed, and we will at that point in time go through the process of determining what kind of needs will happen. At the time, we'll probably start off as a full desktop or a full site visit map until we make a determination otherwise. So if we contact you about a map, you should assume that it'll be a site visit until we determine it to be something other. First-time borrower that is an RU, this is the next question. Do a first-time RUS borrower that is a municipal government need to plan on having a map as condition precedent to closing the borrower signing contracts, starting construction, and if so, at what point? Basically, what will happen is on this situation is it's not necessarily as a condition precedent to closing the borrowing signing contracts, but that may be a reason why we determined to come out and do a map. So our goal is to identify, especially on first-time RUS awardees, that they probably do need to have a map visit done. So you can probably plan on, as a new awardee, to have a map visit done on your organization. And we would hope that we could get out there in a timely manner before you actually start signing contracts. But it wouldn't necessarily be a precedent to closing the borrower signing contracts and starting construction. But keep in mind, as I said, if there is a situation where the construction is a large question mark, then we would notify you very promptly and get that started right away. But I think as a new borrower, the one thing you can take away from it is that we would probably do a map visit just to make sure that our understanding and your understanding of the operations required are clear and concise. Let's see, I think hopefully, how does this apply to a small municipality who's an awardee? So let me just say, as I addressed before, if you're a small municipality who has a lack of internal control structure, we're going to take a look at that from a standpoint of just making sure that you have the necessary tools at hand. Before we even determine to do a map, we'll probably reach out to you to have a discussion on that information. But as a small awardee, we would try to give you, there's a good possibility that you would be a good candidate for a map. Number 10, how much advance notice will you give the awardee of a map? As I like to say, that we'd like to give you as much advance notice as possible. Based on the current situation, though, I don't know how much time that would be. Normally, it would be around 30 days. However, I would assume that in the case that we're working in right now, the circumstances we're operating under, it would be 2 weeks, because we may just be under a situation where we have to get out there and get it done. Basically, we, from our perspective and as members of the team, we try very hard to provide enough information up front so we can be as effective as possible out there. So we want to give the as much advance notice as possible, but you can keep in mind it could be anywhere from 1 day to ultimately, hopefully, 2 weeks to a month. But we will try to give you as much advance notice as possible. So I think that's my last question. I'm going to wrap up now. So keep in mind there'll be another presentation at 1 p.m. Eastern, the reporting requirements, which would be good for, especially for you small municipalities that, just to get an understanding of how our systems operate. And based on that, I'd like to say thank you for listening and taking the time to listen to my presentation, and I hope it was helpful. Thank you and goodbye.